free Negroes, mulattoes, and slaves were said to be the worst element in Virginia society. Why? A few reasons for that were attributed to their high prison rates, unrestrained spending habits, and dependency on whites, all of which were the products of centuries immersed in an oppressive environment with little to no guidance, right? So let's take a look at this right here. Let's look at the description of Virginian Negroes in 1852 by opening up Fredrick Law Olmsted's book titled A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States. We're dealing with the PDF version right now. We're going to turn to page 125 where Olmsted writes this.
During 45 years, according to Howison, the number of white convicts in the Virginia penitentiaries was in the ratio of 1 to about 328 of the whole population. The number of colored convicts, 1 in 67.
We're getting right to it. 1 in every 328 whites were in the penitentiary, compared to 1 in every 67 of those they named colored. But keep these numbers in mind because on the surface, they don't tell the entire truth. Here we go.
The free Negroes and mulattoes are, unquestionably,
says this historian,
the most vicious and corrupting of the varied materials composing our social system.
This opinion here varied amongst the people. Some claimed that it was the Negroes, but others asserted that it was the poor whites.
The criminal law as to free colored persons and slaves differs widely from that applied to whites.
And that's why we have to look at the prison statistics with skepticism, because the laws for Negroes were different than the laws for the whites. We have to remember that the laws were rigged heavily against the blacks, which means that they were often placed in prison for petty things like unsupervised congregating, reading and writing, curfews, and other petty things like that the whites would not have been criminalized for. Now, how much did the rigged legal system contribute to the Negro imprisonment rates? I don't know, right? But I presume that it was probably a substantial amount, right? Now let's keep reading.
The free Negroes occupy an equivocal and most unhappy position between the whites and slaves, and the laws affecting them partake of this peculiarity. Capital punishment is inflicted on them for offenses more lightly punished in whites.
Uh-oh.
They are entitled to trial by jury in cases of homicide and in all capital cases. But for all other crimes, they are tried by justices' courts of Oyer and Terminer, who must be unanimous in order to convict.
And certainly on many cases, it was easy to unanimously agree that the Negro was guilty, even with lack of sufficient evidence, because many of them were purely corrupt, right? Let's continue.
They are subjected to restraint and surveillance in points beyond number. An account of the death of a free colored man who devised by will property to the amount of $30,000 has lately been in the newspapers. I am assured, by one who knew the man very well, of the general accuracy of the narration, though one somewhat important circumstance was omitted. It was stated that the man preferred that his children should continue in the condition of slaves, and gave his property to a man who was to be their master. He gave as a reason for this that he had personally examined the condition of the free blacks in Philadelphia and Boston, as well as in Virginia, and he preferred that his children should remain slaves, knowing that their master would take better care of them than they were capable of exercising for themselves. This was substantially correct. He had been, however, for a long time before his death, in a low state of health, and it is not known how sound or uninfluenced by others his mind might have been.
Now watch this.
The circumstance omitted was that these were illegitimate children by a slave woman, and that he simply left them in the condition in which they were born, in the care of their legal owner, having himself no legal right to dispose of them in any other way.
And what was the law? The children inherited the status of their mother, right? Since the mother was a slave, the children that she had became slaves as well. This was one of the laws that were deliberately created to allow the freaky white men to dabble in private with the slaves and assume no parental responsibility for the offspring. It also ensured a perpetual stock of fresh slaves, right? Here we go.
It is a general custom of white people here to leave their illegitimate children by slaves, and they are very common, in slavery.
From Olmsted's observation, there were a whole lot of illegitimate children created by whites in Virginia, and it was common practice to leave them in the pits of slavery.
The man was himself a mulatto.
The man himself was likely an illegitimate child. This is what Olmsted is implying. And with the laws rigged to trap children in slavery, the cycle continueth with his children, right? Let's keep reading.
At the present rate of wages, any free colored man might accumulate property more rapidly in Virginia than almost any man, depending solely on his labor, can at the North. In the tobacco factories in Richmond and Petersburg, slaves are at this time in great demand and are paid $150 to $200 and all expenses for a year.
When it says the slaves are in great demand and are paid $150 to $200, that's referring to their owners who hired them out getting paid that money, not to the slaves themselves. This is in the 1850s, so the English is a bit different than how we speak it today, right? So we have to be mindful of that with some of these sentences. So again, the slaves were in great demand, and when hired out to the tobacco factories, they earned $150 to $200 for their owners, while the factories paid for all of their food, clothing, and shelter for a year, right? Let's keep reading.
These slaves are expected to work only to a certain extent for their employers, it having been found that they could not be driven to do a fair day's work so easily as they could be stimulated to it by the offer of a bonus for all they would manufacture above a certain number of pounds. This quantity is so easily exceeded that the slaves earn for themselves from $5 to $20 a month.
So the factories tried to drive them or use punishment as a method to motivate them to work more. But they found that this method didn't work as well as providing bonuses to them for completing more than their required task. And anything that they completed beyond the quota went into their own pockets, right? Earning the slaves between $5 and $20 a month. They earned $150 to $200 for their owners, and their additional labor earned money for themselves, right? You see that? This is how the slaves were able to buy the whiskey and the watches that we talked about in previous commentaries, right? Now let's keep reading.
Freemen are paid for all they do at rates which make their labor equally profitable and can earn, if they give but moderate attention and diligence to the labor, very large sums. One man's wages amounted last year, as I am informed by his employer, to over $900, but he is supposed to have laid up none of it.
He spent every nickel and dime of it.
Nearly all the Negroes, slave and free, it is said, spend their money as fast as they receive it.
As soon as the money came into the right hand, it got passed over to the left hand, then it got passed over to someone else's hands, all within the blink of an eye, right? This is what was said about the blacks in 1852, regardless if they were slave or free. Think about that, right? Let's keep going.
And nearly all of it goes in a manner to do them injury.
Alcohol, gambling, and expensive items in some cases. These are some of the things Olmsted mentioned in his book.
Formerly, it is said, the slaves were accustomed to amuse themselves in the evening and on holidays a great deal in dancing, and they took great enjoyment in this exercise. It was at length, however, preached against, and the professors so generally induced to use their influence against it as an immoral practice that it has greatly gone out of fashion, and, in place of it, the young ones have got into the habit of gambling and worse occupations for the pastime of their holidays and leisure hours. I have not seen any dancing during these holidays, nor any recreation engaged in by the blacks, that is not essentially gross, dissipating, or wasteful, unless I except the firing of crackers. Improvidence is generally considered here a natural trait of African character, and by none is it more so than by the Negroes themselves.
Improvidence is a lack in foresight, and Olmsted says that people consider this a natural trait of Africans, and he's including Negroes in America as part of this African category, which is incorrect. But he says that it's the Negroes themselves who validate this idea of being naturally improvident more than anyone else, right? Let's keep reading.
I think it is a mistake. Negroes, as far as I have observed at the North, although suffering from the contamination of habits acquired by themselves or their fathers in slavery, are more provident than whites of equal educational advantages.
Olmsted doesn't buy this as being a natural tendency. He views this as due to circumstance, and he acknowledges that Although a lot of Negroes in the North were struggling with the habits that they acquired themselves or inherited from their fathers in slavery, they are still often more provident or forward thinking than the whites of equal educational background, right? Here we go.
Much more so than the newly arrived Irish, though the Irish, soon after their immigration, are usually infected with the desire of accumulating wealth and acquiring permanent means of comfort. This opinion is confirmed by the experience of our city missionaries, one of whom has informed me that where the very poorest classes of New York reside, black and white in the same house, the rooms occupied by the blacks are generally much less bare of furniture and the means of subsistence than those of the whites. I observe that the Negroes themselves follow the notion of the whites here, and look upon the people of their race as naturally unfitted to look out for themselves far ahead.
Here he's talking about the Negroes in the South, which is where the vast majority of them lived at this time. He noticed that Negroes had taken on the ideas of the whites, and they viewed themselves as being naturally unfit for self-reliance and future independence. And this ties into what he said earlier about the blacks being the main ones voicing this opinion about themselves, right? They had internalized these ideas, which had become deeply connected to Negro consciousness and worldview. Pay attention.
Accustomed, like children, to have all their necessary wants provided for, their whole energies and powers of mind are habitually given to obtaining the means of temporary ease and enjoyment.
Most children don't spend too much time thinking about being an independent adult. For the most part, they have most of their needs provided for, so they spend most of their time in the present with little concern about the future. This is how Olmsted is explaining the Negro mind in 1852. It was like a child focused on short-term needs and pleasures, right? He's seeing the effects of more than 200 years of a conditioned people to think and behave that way, right? Let's get some more.
Their masters and the poor or mean whites acquire somewhat of the same habits from early association with them, calculate on it in them, do not wish to cure it, and by constant practices encourage it. For the means of enjoying themselves, the Negroes depend much on presents. Their good-natured masters, and their masters are generally very good-natured though capricious, like to gratify them and are ashamed to disappoint them, to be thought mean.
This is a much later development in slave master consciousness. Olmsted speaks about how it was looked down upon by many for masters to abuse and mistreat their slaves, similar to how today it's unacceptable for people to mistreat a pet dog or a pet cat, right? It's on that type of level. Now, the earlier slave masters certainly did not hold these types of views towards their slaves, but it was a mentality that was acquired over time by many as the times changed, right? And according to Olmsted, it was to the point where many slave owners were ashamed to be thought of as mean by their slaves, right? Now let's finish up.
So it follows that, with the free Negroes, habit is upon them, the habits of their associates. Slaves make the custom of society, that strongest of agents upon weak minds. The whites think improvidence a natural defect of character with them, expected of them, as they grow old, or as they lose easy means of gaining a livelihood, charitably furnish it to them, expect them to pilfer, do not look upon it as a crime, or at least consider them but slightly to blame, and so every influence and association is unfavorable to providence, forethought, economy.
Meaning whites were pivotal in reinforcing the idea and practice of improvidence amongst the Negroes. They treated them according to that belief, which perpetuated the idea that they were naturally that way. And Olmsted mentions this to demonstrate the inability for Negroes in the South to become provident due to circumstance. Remember that he mentioned that certain classes of Negroes in the North weren't like this, which was partly due to them not being babied and cared for like children all the way up through old age, right? They had to take responsibility for themselves while simultaneously facing oppression in the North. Most of the blacks in the South were kept dependent on their masters while facing oppression, right? And these two different circumstances shaped the consciousness, character, and culture of the people in very different ways. And the effects still linger today, right? I want you to think about that. Think about that as we prepare for the next commentary, where we will see some instances of the childlike mindset in the Negro. And we'll also be introduced to a very special man who rose above this mentality and left a very fine example for many to follow, right? So stay tuned for that, right? Now, right now, what I want to do is thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.